The first time I met Jacob, he didn't say a word. It was an unusually warm spring day, one of those where the air feels thick with humidity, and every small movement left me drenched in sweat. I was sitting on the worn bench in front of my house, trying to get some fresh air after a long, stressful week at work. My thoughts were drifting between the deadlines I'd missed and the email I had left unanswered. I was barely paying attention to anything around me, too consumed by my own spiraling mind, when I noticed him standing at the edge of my front lawn. Jacob couldn't have been older than 12. His clothes hung loosely from his small frame, clearly too big for him. An oversized gray hoodie with frayed sleeves and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. His hair was dark, unkempt, and his skin was pale, the kind of pallor that suggested he hadn't spent much time in the sun. He stood there, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets, staring at me. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, maybe another kid from the neighborhood. I didn't recognize him, but I wasn't the most sociable neighbor. The longer he stood there, though, the more unsettled I became. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, trying to sound casual, though I felt a strange knot forming in my stomach. No answer. I waited a moment, expecting him to say something, but nothing came. Just that same blank, almost vacant stare. I glanced up and down the street, wondering if maybe someone was playing a prank on me. The neighborhood kids sometimes got bored, and I wouldn't put it past them to dare each other to freak out the weird, quiet guy at the end of the street. Me. "Do you need help?" I asked again, more insistently this time. Still silence. I shifted uncomfortably on the bench, feeling the wooden slats dig into my back. Something about the way he stood there, so still, so silent, sent a chill through me. It was irrational, I knew that. He was just a kid, after all. But there was something off. I couldn't place it, but the longer he stood there, the more that sense of unease grew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned. Slowly, almost deliberately, he walked away. He didn't run, didn't glance back. He just kept walking down the street until he disappeared around the corner. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the spot where he'd been standing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though I had no reason to think that. It was just a kid standing there. That's all it was. But still, I couldn't help but feel that strange, cold knot in my stomach long after he was gone. That night, I dreamed of him. I didn't expect to. He hadn't been on my mind when I went to bed. But there he was, in the dream, standing on my lawn, just like he had been earlier that day. Only this time, his eyes were different. In the dream, they were sunken, hollow, like dark pits in his pale face. He was standing closer in the dream too, just a few feet from the porch. He didn't speak in the dream either, just watched me with those empty eyes. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing. The image of his face burned into my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird dream brought on by the strange encounter earlier that day. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but something about the kid unnerved me in a way I couldn't explain. The next morning, I tried to put the whole thing out of my head. I had work to focus on, bills to pay, errands to run. Life doesn't stop just because a kid stood on your lawn and creeped you out for a few minutes. But when I stepped outside to grab the morning paper, there he was again. This time, he was standing even closer to the house, right at the edge of the driveway. I froze, the paper crinkling in my hand. He was wearing the same clothes, that same oversized hoodie, those same worn-out jeans. His face was pale, just as it had been the day before, but today it looked worse. His skin seemed almost translucent, like it was stretched too thin over his skull. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared at me, his dark eyes locked onto mine. Do you need something?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding weak in my own ears. No answer. I stepped off the porch, my heartbeat quickening as I approached him. I didn't know what I was doing or why, but I felt this strange compulsion to get closer, to understand what the hell was going on. But as I took a step forward, he took a step back. Another step forward from me, another step back from him. It was like a silent dance, neither of us getting any closer to the other. Then, just like the day before, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the same corner. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and followed him. I had to know where he was going. I had to know what his deal was. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he needed help. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, I couldn't just let it go. I jogged down the street, glancing around the corner where he had disappeared. But when I got there, he was gone, vanished. The street was empty. The only sound, the distant hum of cars on the main road a few blocks away. I stood there for a long time, looking around, trying to figure out where he could have gone. There were no houses nearby, just a few empty lots that had been sitting untouched for years, overgrown with weeds and tall grass. There was no sign of the kid, no movement, nothing. I went back home, feeling more confused than ever. Who was this kid? And why did he keep showing up at my house? That night, I dreamed of him again. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was 3:14 a.m., far too early for any normal call. My heart was already pounding, the remnants of the dream still clinging to my thoughts. Jacob had been there again, standing closer this time, almost at the foot of my bed. His hollow eyes staring down at me, his mouth slightly open, but no sound came out. I could still feel his presence in the room, that oppressive silence hanging in the air even after I jolted awake. I glanced at my phone and saw a missed call from an unknown number. A voicemail notification popped up a second later, and without thinking, I pressed play. For a few seconds, there was only static, crackling like an old radio that couldn't find a signal. Then a faint whisper. It was too quiet to make out at first, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, trying to focus, and finally, I heard it. "Help me." The voice was weak, distant, like someone calling from the end of a long tunnel. I froze, my blood turning cold. It sounded like a child, like Jacob. I sat up in bed, staring at my phone, my mind racing. Couldn't be. There was no way that voice on the other end could have been him. Kids didn't just call strangers in the middle of the night. But the voice, it was unmistakable. I played the voicemail again, listening to that same faint, desperate plea for help. I knew I wasn't going to sleep again after that. The next morning, I tried to make sense of everything. I replayed the events of the past 2 days in my head. The strange encounters, the silent staring, the disappearing act. Now, this voicemail. None of it added up, but I couldn't shake the growing sense that something was seriously wrong. I had to figure out what was going on. I started by asking around the neighborhood. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the air cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the previous week's heat. I knocked on a few doors, asking the neighbors if they'd seen the boy. Most of them shook their heads. Some looked concerned, others annoyed. A couple of them mentioned they had seen him once or twice just standing by the road, but they assumed he was just another kid from a few streets over. No one knew his name. No one knew where he lived. It wasn't until I reached Mrs. Carter's house, 3 doors down from mine, that I got something more concrete. Mrs. Carter was in her 70s, a widow who spent most of her time tending to her garden or feeding the stray cats that wandered through the neighborhood. She was always pleasant, though a bit forgetful. When I asked her about Jacob, her brow furrowed in thought. "A boy, you say?" she muttered, her eyes narrowing behind her thick glasses. "Yes, I think I've seen him. He used to walk by my house years ago. That threw me off." "Years ago? Yes, poor thing. I remember him from before. Always looked so pale, so sickly. You'd think his parents would have done something about it." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean, before?" She glanced up at me, her eyes wide. "Oh, I suppose you wouldn't know. You weren't living here back then." She paused, then sighed. "That boy, I think his name was Jacob. He died a few years ago. Some sort of illness, if I remember correctly. Poor family." I felt my stomach drop. "Died?" I repeated, barely able to form the word. "Are you sure?" She nodded solemnly, looking back toward her garden. "It was a tragedy. They lived on the other side of the neighborhood, but everyone knew about it. It's a small place, after all. He passed away right in that house." I remember his mother was beside herself with grief. I could barely comprehend what she was saying. My mind was spinning. Jacob was dead? How was that possible? How could a boy who had died years ago be standing in front of my house, staring at me, leaving me voicemails? I must be thinking of someone else. I muttered, trying to rationalize it, even though my gut was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Carter just smiled softly, patting my arm. "Maybe, but I remember him clear as day. Poor Jacob." I thanked her and walked back to my house, my mind racing with more questions than answers. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I needed to know more. I couldn't just leave it like this. Back at home, I pulled out my laptop and did the only thing I could think to do. I searched for any information I could find about Jacob and his family. It took a while, but eventually, I stumbled across an old obituary from the local paper. Asterisk Jacob Foster, age 12, passed away on July 3, 2010, after a long battle with an unspecified illness. He is survived by his parents, James and Mary Foster, and his older sister, Emily. Jacob was a kind, gentle soul who will be deeply missed by all who knew him. Asterisk. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. There it was, in black and white. Jacob had died years ago. The same boy I had seen on my lawn. The same boy who had stood there, silent, staring at me with those dark, hollow eyes. But how? How was he still here? How had he come back? That night I didn't sleep. Every small sound in the house made me jump. Every creak in the floorboards sending chills down my spine. I kept thinking about the voicemail, about that faint, desperate whisper. Help me. What did he need help with? Why was he haunting me? Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was there something more, something deeper that I couldn't understand? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then around 2 a.m. I heard it. A soft knock at the front door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to get up. Every part of me screamed to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard it. But I couldn't. I had to know. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, my legs trembling as I made my way to the front door. The hallway seemed impossibly long, the darkness pressing in around me. The knock came again, soft, insistent. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and opened it. There, standing on my front porch, was Jacob. But this time he wasn't silent. Jacob stood on my porch, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight. His pale face looked even more gaunt than before, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His dark eyes, hollow and sunken, locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I felt the icy grip of fear wrap around my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then finally Jacob spoke. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "You have to help me." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Help you? How can I help you?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes shifted slightly, as if he were struggling to find the words. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked with desperation. "They won't let me rest." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't understand. None of this made sense. Who won't let you rest? Jacob's gaze dropped to the ground, his small, frail body trembling. "Them," he whispered. "They took me. I can't leave." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Took him? Who was they? I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but Jacob took a shaky step backward, his hand reaching out toward the darkness beyond my porch. He pointed to something, but I couldn't see anything. Just the empty street, the shadows cast by the swaying trees. "They're waiting," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't want to go back. Please, help me." I stepped out onto the porch, my bare feet cold against the wood. I didn't know what to say. This couldn't be real. It felt like some twisted nightmare, like I was still dreaming. But Jacob was right there, right in front of me, pleading with me for help. "Who's waiting?" I asked, my voice shaking. But before he could answer, something changed. Jacob's entire demeanor shifted, and his expression darkened. His eyes, those empty, hollow pits, suddenly flicked toward the street, and his small body tensed. "They're here," he whispered. I turned, my heart racing, my eyes scanning the darkness. First, I didn't see anything, just the quiet, empty road. But then, at the far end of the street, I saw them. Figures. Dark, shadowy figures standing just beyond the glow of the streetlights. There were 3 of them standing perfectly still, watching. My blood ran cold as I squinted, trying to make out any details. But they were too far away, their forms obscured by the shadows. I instinctively took a step back, my chest tightening with fear. Who are they?" Jacob didn't answer. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of my porch railing. "They're coming for me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I looked back at the figures, my heart hammering in my chest. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching, waiting. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. Jacob was terrified of them. I don't understand," I stammered. "What do they want?" Jacob turned to me, his eyes filled with a desperation that made my stomach twist. "They took me before. They want to take me again. Please, don't let them." I opened my mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. My mind was spinning, and I felt frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The figures were still there, unmoving, but their presence was suffocating, like a dark cloud hanging over the street. "Why?" I finally managed to ask. "Why are they after you?" Jacob hesitated, his eyes darting toward the figures again. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know what they are. They just came. And when they took me, I got sick. Sicker than I've ever been." And then, his voice trailed off, and I realized what he was saying. The illness. His death. The obituaries had mentioned he died after a long illness. But now it was clear that there was something more to the story. Something darker. Jacob's eyes welled with tears. "I'm so scared," he whispered. "I don't want to go with them again. I didn't know what to do. I was just an ordinary person. How could I protect this kid from something I couldn't even see clearly?" I felt completely out of my depth, but I couldn't ignore the fear in his voice, the pleading in his eyes. "Come inside," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe we can figure this out." Jacob looked uncertain, his gaze flicking between me and the shadowy figures at the end of the street. Finally, he nodded and took a step toward me. But before he could reach the door, a loud, echoing sound filled the air, like the crack of a whip, sharp and sudden. I jumped, turning toward the street, and that's when I saw it. One of the figures had moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk toward us, its dark form gliding over the pavement without a sound. The other two followed suit, their movements eerie and unnatural, like they weren't quite touching the ground. Jacob gasped, his small hand clutching at my arm. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what I was dealing with. Ghosts? Spirits? Something worse? Whatever they were, they weren't normal. They weren't human. I grabbed Jacob's arm, pulling him inside the house and slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, we stood there in the dimly lit hallway, both of us breathing heavily, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. "They can't get in, can they?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. I don't know," I admitted. I didn't know anything anymore. All I knew was that those things, whatever they were out there, and they were after Jacob. I pulled the curtains aside just enough to peek through the front window, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures were still there, standing just outside my house, perfectly still once again. But now they were closer, much closer. "What do we do?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with fear. I didn't have an answer. I was scared too, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. But I knew one thing, I wasn't going to let them take him. Not again. "We'll figure something out," I said, trying to sound confident even though I felt anything but. "We'll figure out how to stop them." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if I believed them. We stood there in the hallway, frozen, listening for any sound that might tell us what those things outside were doing. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about were those dark figures and the way they moved. They weren't bound by the rules of this world, and I had no idea how to fight them, let alone protect Jacob. "We need to hide," I said finally, my voice low and strained. "Just until I can figure something out." Jacob nodded, his face pale, his small frame trembling as I led him toward the back of the house. I was running on instinct now. The safest place I could think of was the basement, a small, windowless room below ground level. The stairs creaked as we descended, and the air grew colder with each step. I flipped on the single dim light bulb, casting a weak glow over the concrete walls and dusty shelves lined with old boxes. We sat in the corner, huddled together in the near darkness. Jacob's breathing was shallow, his small hands gripping his knees tightly. I tried to think, what could I possibly do to stop those things? There were no answers, no easy solutions, only fear. What do they want? I asked, trying to understand. Why are they after you? Jacob shook his head, eyes wide. I don't know. After I got sick, I'd see them just like this. At night, they'd come to the house, stand outside, watching. I thought they were part of my sickness, like a bad dream. But then, they took me. That's when I got worse. And then, I died. I shuddered at the word. Died. He said it so simply, as if it was just a fact of his life or whatever existence he had now. What happened after you died? Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. I woke up, but not where I should have been. Not in heaven or wherever it is people go. I was back here, trapped, and they were waiting. My stomach tightened. This was bigger than I could comprehend. These things weren't just haunting him, they were holding him, pulling him back. I realized then that Jacob hadn't been able to move on because of them, and now they were back to claim him again. A sudden, loud bang echoed through the house, reverberating down into the basement. We both flinched. The front door. They were trying to get in. They're coming, Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I had no idea what I was going to do. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to somehow find a way to escape. But I couldn't leave Jacob. I couldn't let them take him. The banging grew louder, more insistent. The house seemed to groan under the pressure. I could hear the wood creaking, splintering. I felt like a trapped animal cornered, with no way out. Suddenly, Jacob grabbed my arm. They can't take me if I'm not here. I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? He was shaking his head, his eyes wide with desperation. They can only take me if I stay in this place, if I'm still tied to it, to them. I didn't fully understand what he was saying, but I realized he was talking about some kind of release, breaking whatever connection was keeping him tethered to this world. How do we break it? I asked, my voice frantic. How do we stop them? Jacob closed his eyes, his face scrunching as if he was trying to remember something. My sister, he said softly. Emily. She said she would help me, but I never saw her after I died. I think if she knew, she could break the bond. Emily, his older sister, that was the key. I had to find her. I didn't know how long we had before those things broke through the door, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I grabbed my phone and searched for Emily Foster. Luckily, it didn't take long. Her name came up in a local directory. She still lived nearby. I'm going to call her, I said, already dialing the number. Jacob watched me, hope flickering in his eyes. After a few rings, the call connected. Hello, a woman's voice, older now, but with a hint of familiarity. It had to be her. Emily? I asked, my voice urgent. This is going to sound insane, but I need your help. It's about Jacob. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought she was going to hang up. But then she spoke, her voice shaky. Jacob? He's been gone for years. Who is this? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know how to explain this, but Jacob's still here. He's trapped, and I think you're the only one who can help him. Please, you have to come. The silence on the other end was thick with disbelief, but then she finally said, Where are you? I gave her my address, praying she would come quickly. The banging at the door had turned into a full assault. I could hear the wood splintering, the door barely holding. I'm on my way, she said, her voice resolute. Don't let them take him. I hung up the phone and turned to Jacob. "She's coming. Hold on. We're going to get you out of this." But Jacob didn't seem relieved. His face was tight with fear. "I don't think we have enough time." The basement door rattled as something heavy slammed against it. The figures were inside the house now, searching, hunting. They knew where we were. "We have to fight them off," I said, though I had no idea how. Jacob shook his head. "You can't fight them. They're not from this world." Another loud crash, and the door at the top of the stairs burst open. I grabbed Jacob, pulling him behind me, my body shaking as I stared into the blackness at the top of the stairs. The figures loomed there, their dark forms like shadows against the dim light. They were coming. "Stay behind me," I whispered, though I had no idea what I could possibly do to protect him. Then, suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the front door. The figures froze, their heads jerking toward the sound. I heard the front door creak open, and a familiar voice called out from upstairs. "Jacob? Jacob, it's me. It's Emily." The figures hissed, recoiling. I felt a strange shift in the air, as if something invisible had snapped. The basement door groaned as it slowly began to close, the figures retreating into the shadows. Jacob stepped forward, his eyes wide with relief. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. The dark figures were gone. Just like that, the basement door clicked shut, and the house grew silent. We climbed the stairs, and there she was, Emily, standing in the entryway, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her brother. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." Jacob stepped forward, his small hand reaching out to her. "You have to let me go," he said softly. Emily knelt down, pulling him into a hug, sobbing into his shoulder. "I'll let you go," she whispered through her tears. "I'll let you rest." For a long moment, they just held each other. I could feel the weight of the moment, the air thick with sorrow and relief. Then, slowly, Jacob began to fade, his small form growing fainter until he was gone. Emily stayed kneeling there for a long time, her body racked with sobs. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Jacob was finally free, and the house was quiet once more.